If we could get all of the speakers from the biotic response session prior to lunch and after lunch to come up and sort yourself along the front here. And I'm going to suggest we have about 10 minutes for you to ask questions of these speakers. So as they're coming up, I'll start us off. I have a question for you, Dr. Weider. And one of the presentations yesterday used the term critical load as a way that we sometimes characterize an amount of disturbance, potentially via contaminants, that an ecosystem can take before we see I think a significant negative change in that ecosystem. So given the findings from your research so far, what's your perspective on the extent to which we might expect to see critical loads of nitrogen or sulfur? I think that's on.
Right, so simply put, critical load is how much stuff can you dump on a system before bad things happen. So there's a subjective part to that, is what's a bad thing? And so the response to nitrogen or sulfur as you increase dose, I think, is a multi-step response. So the first thing that happens when you start adding more nitrogen above background is biological nitrogen fixation, which brings nitrogen out of the atmosphere. The major input of nitrogen to bogs and poor fens starts to decrease. So that could be interpreted by some people as a bad thing. So then the critical load would be quite low, say 2 to 5 kilograms per hectare per year. If you don't think that knocking back nitrogen fixation is bad, then you can't use that as a critical load factor. So the next thing I think would be you start to stimulate shrub growth. That seems to happen somewhere in the vicinity of 8 to 10 kilograms per hectare per year of nitrogen.
Okay. Hands? Carolyn, go ahead.
Carolyn Campbell with Alberta Wilderness Association. Different presenters could take this, but Aaron maybe mentioned it most directly, but I'd be happy to hear from others. In terms of when there are clear impacts that are being demonstrated in this and other research from disturbance, optimizing resources to go into either the pre-planning of sites or changing behavior during operation. Is there some real direction in terms of current or future research recommending those steps to try to head off some of these worst impacts?
Okay, so let me see if I understand the question correctly. I mean, from the perspective of planning, I mean, I think there is an increasing, I have seen in the energy sector, a change in well pad cutting practices, for example, right? And that recovery rate of a well pad is highly driven by how you prep it. And there's lots of research on how to recover a well pad properly, and the birds will react accordingly. The work I've done in the Northwest Territories, I think, is the stuff that's been the most convincing to me, in that unlike here in Alberta, where we have ATVs kind of trampling lines, so we don't really know what the history of that line's ever been. There's a lot of lines up there that were cut in a particular way, and some of them haven't budged, right? Like, that methodology was such that, you know, the way the bulldozer went in, it's not going to come back without incredible intensive effort. Whereas other ones, it's like there's an amazing regrowth because people are staying off of them. So, I mean, I think those policies are in place to try and use the best practices that minimize the footprint in terms of getting its recovery rate back. So I do see industry working on that, but I mean, you know, up until the turn in the price of oil, I mean, we were building it at such a fast pace, it's completely outstrips the ability of the system to recover at, you know, at a rate that birds would react in a neutral way, essentially. I think that's my answer to the question. I hope I covered what you wanted, Carolyn. Anybody else?
I have a question. Hello, over here.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Dana Schock from Keano College in Fort McMurray. I have a question for Dr. Weider. I hope I've pronounced your last name wrong, correctly, not incorrectly. I was wondering with your deposition studies, how you incorporated the deposition from the city of Fort McMurray itself, because it is just a large urban center with NOx and SOx from all the other usual sources.
We didn't.
Okay.
So we are limited by the locations where these resin collectors, which collect rainfall and snowfall, were deployed in the region. And there are some that are north of Fort Mac but south of Fort McKay. But I don't think that there are any that are more than halfway down to Fort McMurray compared to Fort McKay. So we synthesized all the data from the resin collectors that have been deployed. None were particularly close to Fort McMurray. Every now and then we see a little blip of something that looks like it might be coming up the river valley, but I don't think we have a strong enough database to be able to say that Fort McMurray is the source of anything where we actually had data. So
Is there any intention of incorporating Fort McMurray? I mean, there's 100,000 souls living there, so I was just wondering if at any point that particular component of the impact in the forest is going to be accommodated by these studies.
I think it's a reasonable question for which I don't have an answer. You're asking about what's the future. I don't know what the future holds for this kind of monitoring.
If there's an allowance for recovering cut blocks to ever be considered no longer disturbance, obviously they still will provide a significant habitat value after a certain point. And if there's not a formula for bringing them back in, 100% of the commercial forest in the area would be forever considered disturbed.
Dr. Kariva had to head out early, so Aaron will provide an answer. Thank you, Aaron.
You know, you're right, and I think everybody recognizes that, and I mean, the forestry companies we work with obviously express that, but I think the fundamental thing, and what we do in ABMI and other modeling exercises, is we look at how the wildlife react to it, and I think ultimately when it's going to get knocked off, i.e. this is no longer a harvested area, it's just a forest that's 35 years old, is when we know there's no longer a difference. So in our models right now for birds, we model it as a function of the forest type, the forest age, and then we look at what was the source of that creation. So in other words, age is the primary driver, and then was it generated by harvest or burn? And we know very clearly from lots of research that the first 10 years in our current harvesting practices are completely different than fire, and then they start to get closer and closer. And right now, I mean, we don't really have much more historical data than this, but at about 30 to 35, they're starting to converge back to being, you can't really tell the difference. That being said, however, we have to be careful because the Scandinavian forests are now on third rotation and fourth rotation, and they don't look anything like a natural fire, even when they're 85 to 90 years old. And that's because downwoody material and the amount of snags that that can persist in that system, simply they aren't like they are here in North America. And so a lot of the species that are listed in Europe right now in the Scandinavian forests are things that like deadwood and snags, and those are their biggest, red listed species as a consequence.
Thanks, Aaron. And I think we have time for one more question if there is one. Maybe we're good. Okay, so on behalf of my co-chair for this session, Bruce Pauly, and myself, thank you to you guys, the presenters, for preparing and delivering some really interesting and important presentations. Thanks to you for sticking with us. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Dr. Nason, who will lead into our closing for the session.